Reading 4. So, Henry David Thoreau's 1854 classic Walden is a fascinating book that's been read very differently at different times. Walden recounts, in literary form, Thoreau's experience of living a rustic life on the shores of Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts. In the second half of the 20th century, and that's especially then really, readers were fascinated by Thoreau as a proponent of a back-to-nature lifestyle. The idea of leaving our overly mechanized lives behind in order to live simpler lives closer to nature fascinated the 1960s generation, some of whom actually built wilderness cabins and communes in emulation of Thoreau. He also played a role in inspiring books such as Into the Wild. However, Thoreau can also be seen as the great-grandparent of the modern minimalist movement, as he famously reduced one of Walden's core messages to a two-word imperative: simplify, simplify. This is arguably Thoreau's most useful message for the 21st century. In this sense, Thoreau did something altogether extraordinary, arguably far more extraordinary than living in a semi-wilderness setting, yet nonetheless something all of us should arguably do at some point in our lives. He stepped out of his regular routine to ponder the sort of life that he considered worth living. In practice, he took a couple of years of his life to, as he puts it, to front only the essential things in life. He wanted to strip away all of the stuff and the crap surrounding him to find the meaningful life under it all. Among other things, he considered housing, clothing, and food. Distressed by his neighbors, who even in the 1850s were building increasingly lavish houses, Thoreau pondered what would be the simplest dwelling possible for a single person. His answer? A wooden version of a single-person tent with a floor just big enough for a bedroll. To keep things simple from the start, he proposed recycling a used railway storage box, which could be purchased at the time for $1 for the purpose. Ultimately, he settled on a larger structure, which at 150 square feet may seem lavish by comparison, but is nonetheless about the size of an average garden shed, which his cabin at Walden Pond, pretty much resembled. When Thoreau turned his attention to clothing, he railed against the fashion industry, which even then was centered in Paris. And he did this for encouraging us to buy into fleeting trends. And this is Thoreau here. The head monkey in Paris puts on a traveler's cap, and all the monkeys in America do the same. Because, quote, every generation laughs at old fashions but follows religiously the new, clothing was, as it is even more today, being discarded as unfashionable when it was still quite usable. To simplify things, Thoreau suggested not giving in to the whims of fashion. Instead, own just a few pieces of sturdy clothing and, for good measure, beware of all enterprises that require new clothes. With respect to food, Thoreau made repeated appeals for the simplicity of vegetarianism, and this is Thoreau that I'm quoting here. I have no doubt that is in part the destiny of the human race in its gradual improvement to leave off eating animals. As early as Walden, he repeatedly rejected imported foodstuffs like coffee and tea. His last work, unpublished in his lifetime, was a celebration of local and seasonal wild fruit, which he extolled as superior to their imported counterparts, such as oranges and bananas that were being shipped into the U.S. ports. That would be like nearby Boston to him, and that was by way of sailing ships. In general, he was certainly given to his share of philosophical musing throughout his life. Thoreau repeatedly drew his and our attention to the most basic of our day-to-day needs, which he provocatively argued can be satisfied far more simply than we usually imagine. But Thoreau did something more, something bigger, and altogether extraordinary. He challenged us to ponder the role that we were given at birth. This has profound environmental implications. So, think of life like a play, a theatrical performance that has been scripted for you. When you were born, you stepped into a role, exceptionally intricate, that was written long before you were even conceived. For example, where you would live, how you would get around, what you would eat, all this was spelled out for you in detail. It's not that you weren't given some latitude in playing the role. For example, you could choose the car that you wanted and could afford. However, you could not easily choose to forgo having a car. Not if you wanted to play the role successfully. And by that, I mean, be seen as a success. Like many generations before, my generation lived a life scripted for us. In that sense, we did not take up the Rose Challenge to reconsider the life written for us. What saw us? In many ways, ours was an over-the-top performance in the role, as we did so many things bigger and more outlandishly. For example, in dramatic contrast to Thoreau, we live in houses that are 2.5 times larger than those of our parents, which, incidentally, were already 6 times larger than Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond. The new generation coming on the scene, that of my students, cannot live the life scripted for them, as this would be environmentally disastrous. To some, this will be frustrating, perhaps enormously so, as the pressure to conform to that role, which comes from 1,000 directions in our culture, can be pretty intense. Even little things like forgoing a car or forgoing meat eating can be met with a backlash from those happily living the scripted role who see this as a threat to that way of life. If you happily accept the role handed to you, this might be especially frustrating. Yes, the generation that came before you had lots of things that you will not have. Let's face it, we had awesome amounts of stuff. However, it's not at all clear that any of this made us happy. Indeed, it has arguably done just the opposite. In any event, what this new generation needs to do is take up Thoreau's challenge and reconsider and rewrite the script. This can be seen as an opportunity and a huge, and I would argue exciting one. However, it's also an enormous challenge. So my question is, just what do you make of Thoreau and his challenge to an overly bloated life? Given that he is responding to life in 19th century America, imagine what his reaction would have been to our present-day consumer world. Is Thoreau onto something? Should we all simplify? So let's talk about the class discussion of Walden. Note that the following observations, as usual, which are in italics in the text, have not been paraphrased or altered, though I do correct the occasional typo, and because of space concerns, often just part of the comment is reproduced here along with my reply. In working through these, I will first quote an observation by a student, followed by my thoughts. First observation, I wasn't a major fan of this reading. Thoreau stood out to me as spoiled and at times even racist. Savages? I mean, come on. Still, despite not enjoying reading such long-winded prose, I can see how it relates to today. He mentions how buying a house can take ages and that it would be simpler to buy or build a smaller one that you can own. One that won't take you most of your life to pay off so that you may enjoy the fruits of life. Even more relatable was that he talked about college dorms and how his house cost as much as one, except that he didn't need to pay for it annually or have to worry about loud and obnoxious, roommates or neighbors. I believe these two things were what intrigued me most and caused me to go, okay, I see what you mean, after paragraphs of barely understanding what was being said. And that's the end of that perceptive quote. Good point. As I made clear in the introduction to our online edition of Walden, there are a number of things in the book that are off-putting, if not reason enough to forever put it down. It's also the case that one can, as this comment notes, sometimes read whole paragraphs of Walden without a clue as to what Thoreau is getting at. In many ways, Thoreau is certainly a product of his age. This is especially evident when he talks about people from cultures other than his own. Although he may, in fact, be drawing attention to something valuable about their culture, more often than not, one gets the impression that he still, nonetheless, sees himself as fundamentally superior to those individuals. In instances like this, it would be nice to be able to see these beliefs as being Thoreau's culture speaking through him rather than his own deeply held convictions. The problem is that other writers at the time didn't buy into these beliefs, but rather, in fact, drew attention to them as problematic. Moreover, as Thoreau is urging us to reconsider many of our own beliefs, it's discouraging that he doesn't do so in his own case. So while I certainly do not think that we should ignore any of this, it's useful to provisionally bracket off, as did the person who made this comment, so that we can better understand what Thoreau has of value for us. For example, as this person notes, by reconsidering whether or not we would like to have a big house instead of spending, most of your life working to pay it off, it would be better to spend that time enjoying the fruits of life. Next comment. I remember doing a project on Henry David Thoreau in 8th grade and learning that his time at Walden Pond, and initially thinking it was quite impressive and that he survived on his own. Then I learned that he was not really very far from civilization. Now that I know more about the world as I've grown up as well, I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that, and this is you, Ken, mentioned that he wouldn't have been able to do this if he was not a straight, wealthy white male. That was an aspect of Walden that I had not considered before this class, and it is quite true. So that's the end of that quote. As I noted in my introduction to our online edition of Walden, because Thoreau's life was one marked by privilege, most Americans would not have been able to do what he did by, quote, moving back to nature, which was, as this comment notes, not very far from civilization. In this sense, as a back to nature manual, Walden will likely appeal to a limited number of people. I suspect that this is one of the reasons why some people have been turned off by Walden. One could imagine generations of readers putting down the book saying, well, I certainly couldn't go out and live in some far-off wilderness, or for that matter, neither did Thoreau, regardless of what he makes it how he makes it seem in his book. Fair enough. However, the aspect of Thoreau's project that interests me most, and which I focused on in the introduction, which is simplifying one's life by becoming more mindful of it and its many details, this strikes me as something that most people can, one way or another, achieve. This is one of the reasons why we're not approaching Walden as a back-to-nature manual, but instead, for lack of a better term, as a back-to-life manual, in the sense as it instructs us how to live a more authentic life, which, and this is not incidental to our purpose, will have a significant smaller climate footprint. So the next quote. When I saw that Ken assigned us to read Henry David Thoreau's works, I questioned, why in the hell is Ken making us read this work of literature? How can this possibly relate to our class on the climate crisis? But I was already making such assumptions without having read the text yet. As I started to read, I was pretty intrigued with what Thoreau has to say about the simplistic life he believed in. It amazed me how this work was written so long ago, and for Thoreau to have already caught on to such ideas is just insane. I could imagine how cruel his critiques would have been in today's time. Walden was written in 1854, the 19th century, an era that doesn't even compare to what our economy has come to now. By that, capitalistic, materialistic, maximalized, and straight up money hungry in order to live the American dream of a lavish lifestyle. End quote. The idea that a work of literature, especially a somewhat old one, can impact our lives in a meaningful way is not necessarily an intuitive one. Yes, reading literature can be a fun diversion, but we don't usually think of it as asking something of us, let alone something that can completely change our lives. But this is exactly what Walden does, as it is asking something big of us, to completely reevaluate our lives. Walden is striking because Thoreau not only thoroughly, as his comment notes, believed in the simplistic life that he advocates, but actually lived that life. In other words, Thoreau is not just asking us to reevaluate our lives, but to act on what we learn by radically changing the way that we live. As I have observed, one of the things that I find interesting about cultural norms is that when we are born into them, they generally seem pretty normal. So, if you were born into a culture where nearly everyone drives a car, nothing seems more natural than getting one of your own as soon as you can. However, there's really nothing natural about this desire, as it's entirely culturally constructed. Hence, examining a full-fledged car culture that has existed for generations like our own may not be as interesting as looking at when this culture historically emerged. If you can catch it at the moment, in this case a little more than 100 years ago, you often find people raising all sorts of concerns about these new practices, such as, and this is to give just one example, fears that the automobile use would result in a nation of people who would not be exercising enough as they were when they walked and bicycled around. So Thoreau is interesting because he lived at a time when consumer culture was just beginning to take off in the United States. To us, the nascent consumerism of the time may seem quaint and virtually insignificant. However, to Thoreau, it was anything but, as he saw how it was fundamentally changing people. As Walden makes clear, this deeply concerned him. The next quote. When I began reading this, I wondered why Ken had assigned us such a seemingly trivial piece of literature and how that it connected to this class. I soon realized that the purpose of reading this was to get the reader to reevaluate all the unnecessary luxuries that we have in our lives and to convince us why we don't really need all of those extra things. Thoreau repeatedly argues that man has put himself in his own state of misery. All of the advantages that we've made and the amenities we've created have only left us more anxious to have it all. We've mistakenly put ourselves in a vicious cycle of never feeling fully fulfilled with what we have. This has left us miserable and, from his economic point of view, poor. So how then does all this fit into the environmental theme of this class? Consumerism. And not simple consumerism, but consumerism without thinking about the consequences it could be having. That's the end of that quote, an excellent quote. Thoreau's central argument is that we have done this to ourselves, and this comment aptly notes humanity put itself in a state of misery. We pursued happiness by consuming all sorts of stuff that all sorts of companies encouraged us to buy. However, as Thoreau notes, not only doesn't consumerism make us happy, it puts us into a state of misery. According to Thoreau, we spend our lives in a vicious cycle of desiring what we do not have, working long hours and unhappy jobs just to get these objects of desire, only to find that they do not give us the happiness that we had hoped for. Hence, as this person notes, quote, we've mistakenly put ourselves in a vicious cycle of never feeling fulfilled with what we have. This has left us miserable and, from Thoreau's economic point of view, poor. Well said. Not only does Thoreau diagnose the problem with the human condition in the age of consumerism, he prescribes a cure. Simplify. As this comment fleshes it out, quote, I soon realized that the purpose of this reading was to get the reader to evaluate all of the unnecessary luxuries that we have in our lives and to convince us that we don't really need all of those extra things. End of the quote. If this were not bad enough, in the century and a half separating us from Thoreau, we've done something else that has put us in a new state of misery. And the aforementioned vicious cycle of never feeling fulfilled with what we have is now bringing about a whole new kind of misery to the human race and planet by way of the climate crisis. As this person notes, the problem is consumerism, and not simple consumerism, but consumerism without thinking of the consequences that consumerism could be having. Although climate change deniers would like to deny that our actions are bringing misery to the human beings and to the planet, the fact that climate change scientists have reported to us, that speaks to itself. Hence, just as consumerism and the vicious pursuit of stuff was really beginning to take off in the United States, Thoreau clearly saw that it brought not happiness but misery. But he didn't know that it was already beginning to bring a whole new kind of misery to human beings on the earth, as atmospheric CO2 levels were beginning to rise in his era because of the so-called Industrial Revolution that produced all of that stuff. So the next quote. Regarding Thoreau's point about consumerism, he probably couldn't have imagined a world where everyone is able to show off their stories with a click of a button or a small phone. This curated view of life pushes people to want the same objects as their favorite influencer because they want to be happy and content. That's the end of the quote. Although consumerism in Thoreau's era may seem quaint to us now, it's anything but quaint today. In many cases, this is the result of advertisers becoming more sophisticated, very sophisticated in the age of the internet. Back when I was growing up, advertisers had a limited number of options: TV, radio, magazines, billboards, things like that. What's intriguing is that none of these options were directly in the business of selling products. In other words, a TV network did not care whether or not it was selling you cigarettes or dishwashing detergent. Instead, though it may be a little unnerving to think about it in these terms, TV networks are not in the business of selling products, but rather viewers, people. Companies like the Nielsen Media Research track how many, as well as what kind of viewers a particular TV show has. Networks then sell these viewers to advertisers who are indeed in the business of selling products like dishwashing detergent. If networks deliver advertisers an audience of people that would likely buy this particular product, then they're selling to the advertisers, which in the case of dishwashing detergent would have largely been women in the 1950s. They are paid in direct proportion to the number of viewers, people that they sell. If a TV show is a flop and hence doesn't attract a significant number of viewers that can be sold to advertisers, it will, quickly be canceled. Conversely, a show is a success if it attracts millions of people that can be sold to the highest bidder. Although in certain ways, advertising is far more sophisticated now, in a sense, not much has really changed. However, now it is often influencers and social media companies who are in the business of selling people. Let's take everyone's favorite example, YouTube. As you may know, the goal of many YouTube influencers is to develop a large audience of viewers. Once an influencer has enough, they can then monetize their channel. This is another way of saying that the influencers can sell those viewers, people, to an advertiser. As far as which advertiser would like to buy that particular group of people that the influencers are selling, there's no need for the influencer to worry about this. YouTube generally knows more about an influencer's audience than they do, as they have been tracking their online activities. Hence, YouTube knows that the audience may be principally composed of young women, for example. In point of fact, YouTube knows a great deal about each and every subscriber, i.e. has hundreds and even thousands of data points on each of them. What YouTube does is act as a broker, matching up with the right people to sell to advertisers interested in buying that particular lot of people. Of course, YouTube charges a fee for this service, even if would-be influencers did not have many viewers, people to sell, they can still benefit here, as advertisers may give them modest compensation by sending them free product, which they can then directly market to the viewers by way of, haul videos, or by doing reviews of the product. Influencers like this because they get free swag. Advertisers like it because they not only get an audience that just by giving out stuff, they also don't have to go to the trouble of producing an advertisement, as the influencer takes on the job of making the product seem desirable. Creates a commercial. In fact, this is likely an effective form of advertising, as viewers may well be more likely to purchase the product on offer, as they may trust the influencer. Sadly, I suspect that most influencers are not aware of how the underlying system works and what it is that they are actually doing. Thoreau would no doubt have been shocked by all this. But in a way, there is really nothing new here, as the underlying enterprise is to groom us to become good, ideally rampant consumers. However, to us, the way that this project has permeated our lives in the age of the internet is more than a little disturbing, as the following comment notes. So, quote, "The script of life is basically written for them every time you crave to be another human being on your favorite social media. I don't think there is going to be a time in which consumerism is not rampant. We are programmed to keep desiring, and the rise of technology has amplified that." That's the end of the quote. Well, I totally understand this person's fatalism in terms of online influencers and social media. There is, in fact, a simple solution here. We need a new generation of socially responsible influencers who care about the well-being of their viewer and the planet rather than just personal gain. And of course, what is also needed is a new generation of viewers that would support such influencers directly by way of services like Patreon and all, rather than by purchasing products that they are hawking. One of the intriguing things about YouTube is that anyone can post material for free. In other words, you do not have to be someone selling something in order to upload a video. Of course, YouTube now reserves the right to add in advertisements to any video whenever they like. Nonetheless, if you want to post a video of something like your kitten being silly, you are perfectly free to do so. In case you didn't know, silly kitten videos are a thing on YouTube, something I recently discovered. What this means is that an influencer can use their platform in nearly any way that they choose, though there are limits here, as they cannot, for obvious reasons, do something like spread hate speech. Imagine if an influencer with millions, even nowadays hundreds of millions of viewers, decided not to act for personal gain by selling these people to advertisers. Instead, knowing that as influencers they have, enormous influence on their viewers, they instead acted in a socially responsible rather than exploitative manner and used their platform to help make the world a better place. In other words, as this comment succinctly notes, people, quote, crave to be another human on your favorite social media, quote. Sometimes we act on the desire to be the influencer by emulating them. If they dress a certain way, we dress that way. If they purchase certain products, we too purchase them. Influencers monetize this influence. In other words, act for personal gain by selling their viewers to companies that want to sell us their clothes and products. Even if the influencer is not directly selling a product, they may perhaps inadvertently, be doing harm here. For example, if they celebrate a lavish lifestyle filled with private jets and a fleet of cars, the influencer may influence their viewers to act in a similarly environmentally destructive manner. What would happen, however, if the influencer wasn't displaying products or a lifestyle that is wildly unsustainable from an environmental point of view, but instead showed them trying to make the world a better place? Curious what this would be like? In a sense, this is what Leonardo DiCaprio did with the film Before the Flood. Not every influencer would, of course, need to travel the world and in order to make a difference. Instead, they could be doing something small, like getting involved in a local activist group. Instead of showing a haul of fast fashion, the weekly installment of their channel could show them brainstorming climate solutions with friends, or out protesting with them, or canvassing for votes for a candidate with a strong environmental climate platform. In so doing, an influencer would largely cease to be a person out for private gain, but rather an activist working to make the world a better place. So, the next comment. In the first chapter, Thoreau, discussed the absurdity he found in, spending the best part of one's life earning money in order to enjoy a questionable liberty during the least valuable part of it. This part stuck out to me because while it may not have related to climate change, this way of life, way of life so many of us are used to and plan ahead for, may turn from a question of liberty to virtually no liberty at all if the Earth continues to warm at the way it already has been. Liberty will be quite meaningless if we can no longer reasonably live on the planet we are born into. That's the end of the quote. This is an intriguing observation. In a sense, Thoreau is offering us two options. One, to live our lives as they were scripted for us, or two, to try to find a more authentic way of living. Thoreau clearly feels that we should take the second option. But what about this questionable liberty, to use Thoreau's words, of the first option? In Thoreau's era, going his route would, as far as he was concerned, have meant an authentic and presumably unhappy life. But as this comment makes clear, the stakes are far higher in the 21st century, as the first option, living the life that most of Americans now do, will severely restrict liberty for not only Americans, but for most human beings, as well as a host of additional beings on the planet. In other words, if we pursue the liberty scripted for us, this will not only mean that we will never personally have true liberty, which is essentially Thoreau's point, but in the era of climate crisis brought about through the misguided pursuit of liberty, we will greatly hamper everyone's liberty. As this comment suggests, liberty will feel quite meaningless if we can no longer reasonably live on the planet we were born on. When considering Walden through the lens of living in urban area instead of wilderness, as suggested by Ken, it's the next comment. It's exciting to see how Thoreau's ideas can be applied. Tiny homes like the ones introduced in the documentary Minimalism come to mind as an improvement to urban life. I think that they are a great upgrade from Thoreau's 150 square foot cabin and are filled with features to make them more adaptable to fit people and cater to varying circumstances. One of the difficulties with Walden is that the lifestyle that Thoreau is suggesting can seem extreme. After all, most people will not likely find the idea of living out in a garden shed very appealing. However, all sorts of people are not only advocating for a much simpler way of life, but, like Thoreau, are rolling up their sleeves and actually doing it. Minimalism, the tiny house movement, slow food, slow fashion, and a host of similar movements have now moved into the mainstream. None of these are, strictly speaking, emulating Thoreau's experience at Walden Pond. Instead, whether directly influenced by Thoreau or not, the activists bringing about these transformations are doing exactly what Thoreau suggested, rethinking how we can satisfy some of our human needs in a way that will not only make us happier, but more environmentally sustainable in the bargain.